So let's get started. First of all, I'm Leticia Moraes. I don't know if you know me, and I'm currently work at Troika, and I am a member of the IATEFL YLT SIG, the SIG from IATEFL that's dedicated to young learners and teens. I don't know if you know Troika, but one of the things we like doing is to work on the training of teachers, and that's what we're here for. And today we're going to talk about projects to develop teenagers' awareness of cultural diversity. Something very important in this webinar is that we're going to cover whys and whats mostly. The hows will depend a little bit on the context you are teaching, and if you know the whys and the whats, it gets easier to adapt projects and activities to your own reality. This can happen much more easily than if you know the hows, but you don't know exactly why and what, then adapting can be more challenging. So let's start with why, and why specifically, why culture? So if you could contribute in the chat box why you think it's important to deal with cultural awareness and to raise this awareness of cultural diversity when we're talking about teenage learners, lower secondary, upper secondary learners. If you could type in the chat box why you think that's important. Any ideas why developing cultural awareness is important for teenagers? Can you hear me? Okay. So any ideas? All right, so when we think of culture, we have to, just a second. Well, I cannot see your answers, but let's move on, all right? So when you think of culture, it encompasses lots of different things, and it goes from different nationalities and obviously different cultures, but it's not restricted to that. Different cultures can be within the same country. So if you think of Brazil, the culture we have in Sao Paulo may be different from the Northeast, and it may be different from the South, from Rio, if you think of the same geographic region, it's also different. And it's not only related to geography within a country as well, so it can be related to the different cultures within a group. So you may have within the same group of learners, students with very different cultural backgrounds and who understand things, see things from a different way depending on what their family background and so on. So working on cultural diversity helps to put together all these learners together. It helps us to know how to deal better with the reality. And of course, if we're thinking of the world we live in nowadays, where getting in touch with someone from the other side of the world is quite easy, and traveling, depending on your reality, is also can also happen more frequently than it used to in the past, and much more quickly. We tend to get in touch with with people from different countries much more often, and knowing how to deal with the differences will help us avoid cultural clashes when we are traveling abroad, when we are receiving foreigners, and also when we are interacted with someone from our own area, but who has a different culture, right? So this is a very important reason why we should deal with culture in the classroom. But it's also important to think about the what. The what here, I want to not to connect with culture, because as I said before, culture can be lots of different things. So it can be from different nationalities to different ways of seeing the world, from different interests. So if you have, nowadays, if you think of people who cycle, this is also a kind of culture. If you think of gamers, this is another kind of culture. I want to think about what related to projects. So because we're talking about both culture and projects. So what is a project? Take a little time for you to think. How would you define the idea of project? Think a little bit, think about how you yourself would define that. Okay, could you think about some things? All right, so projects in the same way of culture can be defined in very different ways. But I brought to you a definition that I really like, and I want to show that to you. That's it. An extended assignment that usually lasts longer than a single lesson. As you can see, this definition is really broad, so it can encompass lots of different things. And I chose this definition on purpose because it encompasses different ways in which projects can be used. Because projects can go from something very structured that is totally defined by the teacher, really, to something totally free that emerges from the need and that is mostly decided by learners. And we have all shades of gray in between this. So other definitions of projects, in order to cover all of that, they start to get really complex. And it's easy to get something out of that. So if we think of projects as something that would take longer than a lesson, that it's something longer, it would demand more work, it would encompass everything. However, we cannot, what would be then a project? How can you guarantee that this extended assignment is not only an assignment, it's not, it's actually a project? Well, there are 6 features, according to Stroller, that would guarantee that an activity is not only an activity, but it's really a project. I'll give you some time to think about how you would complete this 6 post-its with features that all projects should share. Think a little bit, how would you complete the 6 of them? Could you think of any? Let's see if you have anything in common with what Stroller mentioned and I brought to you. Okay, so the first feature mentioned by her is that it's content focused. So the focus of a project is not the language that's going to be developed. It's really the content of the project. So if you're thinking about the language, the vocabulary, the grammar, speaking skills, and listening skills, all of these will be developed with the project, but they are not the focus. They will be developed, but because of the content, because of what students are doing. So what motivates the learning, it's not the language, but it's the content. So this is the first. The next one is that it's student-centered. So the star of project work is not the teacher. The teacher is not in the center of instruction. The student is. So it's important for the teacher to take a step back and let students take this role as protagonists. Something else is that it's collaborative. And being collaborative doesn't mean only that it has to be in groups. Usually, we work with projects in groups or maybe pairs or something like that. But it can also be cooperative, even if, in the end, the outcome is individual. So learners work together and define together what they're going to cover, but each one can end up with their own project. But it depends on your context. This kind of setting tends to work better when assessment is an issue, or depending on how many times students can meet outside school, for example, to organize the project, or how much time you have in the classroom for learners to do that in the classroom. So being cooperative and collaborative is essential for a project, but this doesn't mean that only that individuals cannot present the result of their project. The next feature would be integrated skills. So as I mentioned when I was talking about content focused, to develop the project, necessarily learners have to use different skills. So it's not only reading, it's not only speaking, it's not only writing, it's not only reading, it's not only listening, it's a combination of those. So which skills are going to be combined depend on the kind of project you're developing. Apart from that, we need to have a concrete end product. So if you end this kind of work with something that's not concrete, you cannot show, you cannot present, then it's probably not a project. It can be an activity, a communicative activity, but not actually a project. So for the project, you have to produce something. It can be a poster, a flip book, a campaign, even a debate. It can be a podcast, it can be a video. It can vary what you're going to produce. It can be a guide, but you need to have a concrete end product. This is essential for projects. And the last one, which some may say I cheated a little bit because it's actually more than one, but they are all interconnected. It's because projects are potentially motivating, stimulating, empowering, and challenging for learners. And why do I say potentially? Because if by any reason students don't connect with the idea of the project, then it's not going to be any of those. The idea of the project is that it really challenges learners to think about a topic, to think about how specific content can be presented, to think about what is relevant for the audience. So the challenge can come not only in terms of language, but also in terms of content, because remember that projects are content focused, right? So potentially projects are extremely motivating, stimulating, empowering, and challenging. So with all of this in mind, then comes the question, why projects to work with culture, right? So if we stop to think about these features of projects and the idea of culture, projects give room for learners to really look at different cultures, to really think about how difference takes place and how different things can be. And you have lots of room for critical thinking as well. So the flexibility of projects allows the teacher to work on this awareness of different cultures, on the understanding of difference, and that things can be dealt with in different ways, and that different cultures see things in different ways. So for me, I'd say that's a perfect match, because you have the variety that culture itself brings and the flexibility that projects bring. So they match perfectly, right? And with this in mind, I want to share with you some projects, some idea of projects. So I was part of the implementation, of the process of implementation of a course which dealt a lot with project work. So this course worked with project work and was aimed at lower secondary learners aged 11, 12 years old, and they were beginners. So it was their very first semester of studying English. And these are some of the ideas. I'll give you some time to go over these ideas of projects and to think about what kind of culture can be dealt with within each of them. These projects, they were devised and thought of for a specific audience, a specific kind of learner, because it was within a large language institute, but we have a very clear profile of learner. and they also were thought to develop culture within the process of the project. So take your time, read a little bit, and think, okay, what kind of culture can be worked with within each of these projects? Okay, so I'll go over some of them and share with you what I saw happening in practice when this project happened in real life. All right. So when we worked with the booklet, students could choose what person they were going to talk about and why they admired those people. And the choice of personalities or of people brought enormous variety to the classroom. So there were those who talked about sports people. There were those who talked about people from their families. There were those who talked about actors and actresses. And in many cases, these people they talked about came from different cultures. And then in order to talk about these people, they needed to understand a little bit better the culture of this person. And what happens is that usually here the culture related to the country. So if they were talking about, for example, an American basketball player, they understood that basketball is a big thing in the United States if compared to Brazil, and that famous basketball players can be very important people there, and which is different here. Here we would have more this happening with football players, and they could make this kind of comparison in terms of sports that were popular in different countries, for example. When we talked then about, when we worked with the webpage with hints for people traveling to different places, then here different cultures from different nationalities or even different places within the same country appeared really quickly. And it was interesting that some students chose different places within Brazil, and they were able to identify some different ways in which people related, and that, for example, in Rio, if you were going to meet someone, and you would greet them with kisses, you would have to kiss them twice on the cheek. And whereas in Sao Paulo, it would be only once. So these kind of things emerged from this project. The poster about what we have and what we are was really interesting to show learners that different people and their peers within the same group would value different things, and they are different people, and that's okay to be different. It's okay to have a different culture. When we talked about online school guide, this was really interesting because they could notice that different schools have different cultures. So for this project, students had to investigate the kind of subject students had, the kind of extra activity students had, and the kind of uniform they had. And they could notice that sometimes within the same city, and sometimes schools that were actually near each other, things happened in a different way. And this helped them broaden their horizons in terms of what a school is. Because when they thought of schools, they had their own schools in mind. And after this project, they noticed that different schools can have different cultures and things can happen differently. The board game is more obvious because it already deals with different cultures. And when we open the possibility of students actually choosing the culture they wanted to talk about, this brought a variety of different input in terms of culture going on. A student, for example, chose to talk about Sweden because her sister was living there. And then she had more information about that culture. And this was really interesting for the other people. So we can go beyond only, we don't have to focus only on speaking countries, cultures, especially because nowadays, when we talk about English, most of the time we're going to use English to talk with people who are not native speakers of English. We use English as a lingua franca. So opening to other cultures that are not English-speaking cultures is also interesting. When we talked about the bulletin board poster talking about different disabilities, this raised their awareness that a blind person, for example, or a deaf student can be in their own groups, and that they're different. Yes, they are, but they can interact with them in the same way, and that they see things in a different way. So a blind person will see things, pardon the pun, but they will see things in a different way. So they will get input in a different way. So sounds, they get different meanings, and how this impact the way we interact with the world. So we're talking about the culture of the blind people, the culture of deaf people, and this was really interesting as well. The web page was really interesting for them to see that culture changes over time. So our culture nowadays is different from the culture our parents had, especially if we come to think of all the technology we have available nowadays. So if you think that nowadays we have everything on the cell phone here in our hands all the time, and in the past things weren't that easy, the way we interacted with people were different. When we talked about the campaign to improve teens' life in a specific place, students had to look at the specific place and think, okay, what those people need, not what the students themselves wanted and liked, but what the people in those places needed and wanted. So this also raised their awareness that sometimes what I want is not exactly what another person wants or needs. So it's important to look at the other and to understand what they need and want, right? And when they had to organize a school event, they also have to look at the other person and to see what was important for them, not only for the learner. And this is very interesting, this thing of helping the teenage learner look at the other is very important, because this is something that they still don't have. For them, it's very different. They can see themselves very well. They can place themselves in the world. But for them, it's different to understand the perspective of the others. This is something that's being developed, cognitively developed, and it has to do with their development. And this is the right moment to think about that, because otherwise we may end up with adults who cannot see things from a different perspective, who don't have empathy for the other, and because of that are not so understanding as we disconnected world would demand. Okay, so these are projects that were tailor-made for a specific context, but coming up with a project from scratch is not always that easy in terms of timing, because it can be really time-consuming to get everything organized. But if we look at more modern materials for teenagers, we'll see that many of the books that are being published by different publishers, they already bring suggestions of projects. But we have to look at the projects and see, okay, how can I adapt this project to my own reality? And that's why I wanted to work with the whats and the whys. Okay, I brought now some suggestions of projects that came from published materials for us to look at what kind of culture can be worked with within that project. So let me show the first one. So this is the first one. This is a project for A1 students thinking about the Common European Framework. It's really guided, so you have the steps, step 1, 2, 3, and 4. You have the option for learners to choose the topic for their podcast. So they can talk about their idols, daily routine, free time, and resolutions for the year. Then they are prompted to organize the content, and to actually make the podcast and share their work. So it's really guided. If we come to think about what kind of culture can be worked with within this project, although it's not clearly stated, when we started talking about idols, this can open room for culture if they choose idols from different countries or from different regions or from different areas. So this can be room for them to work with cultures. In the same way that in the previous options, you had the idea of talking about a celebrity they enjoy. If they talk about our daily routine, they can think about daily routines in different regions, in a cold region, in a hot region. So what changes? How does it impact? How does it impact the culture of that region? The same for free time and also resolution. So how resolutions change according to culture? This can add some challenge for the project. And remember that challenge is one of the features of a project, right? So this is for A1 learners. And of course, here, depending on the work you're doing, you may need to give some support in terms of language. After all, they are A1, all right? This is another option. This is for A2 learners, considering the CFR. This is related to organizing a sports day at school. So they start with some questions to talk about sports. So the sports they practice, what sports they practice at school, what other sports they would like. Here, you can already think about how which different sports are practiced in different cultures. So even if you look at the images, for example, we have curling here. So it's something that in Brazil wouldn't be so popular, or wouldn't happen that often because we don't have that weather, we don't have cold winters or cold enough. So culture can already have a role here. Continuing the proposal for this project, then you have guidance to get together in groups, collect information for their sports day. So what sports are they going to include? How they're going to present their findings. So thinking about the local culture is also important. So what's more effective for the local culture? A poster, video, a leaflet, or presentation. So you already cover some different kinds of culture here. So this is also a very rich project in terms of culture. Although it talks about sports, and at first we would say, no, it's sports, it's not necessarily culture, but it gives room for that. Let me show you a different option. This is already a culture project. It's A2 plus B1, and it talks about smartphones and the question, do smartphones make you smarter? So here it is a culture project. It's talking about something that's really close to learners. That's the use of smartphones nowadays. And here you can exploit the idea of having this technology nowadays and not having in the past, for example, as we even mentioned before. Or even there are some cultures that don't encourage the use of technology, like the Amish, for example. So can we say that we are smarter than Amish people because of the smartphone or not? So depending on your teaching context, this kind of discussion can be brought up. And also, but it can also work with the idea of different times going on, or areas where you don't have access to smartphones. So we can work with this. Another option, this is already B2 in terms of language. This material, it brings options of projects. This is a unit that talks about giants, different giants. So you have from giant animals, for example, and the first idea of a project is to make an animated action movie with one of the giants in the unit. Here, depending on the choice of giant, you can even work with the question of the issue of bullying, because they are the prejudice that the giants may suffer or not, or are they valued because they are big, or are they considered weird because of that? So is that fair, or are they just different? And we can work with difference in that sense. When they also have two other options, then you have the Find the Fossil game. So they would work with different creatures, and then the third option, the next option, would be to give a presentation on a modern giant. So they would choose, and here again you would have room to actually talk about the idea of prejudice or not, the prehistoric and giants that they saw in the unit, and so on. So sometimes, even if the culture is not obviously there, projects, this idea of different cultures or the difference often emerge from students thinking about the topics in a freer way. So it is always an interesting thing to keep in mind whenever you're planning a project. But this has to be thought for your own groups, for your own teaching context, because the kind of culture and difference and issue that's going to emerge will vary a lot depending on depending on the kind of group you have, the mix of learners you have in front of you. Sometimes if you have a very diverse group in itself, it's already going to be, the difference is going to merge more naturally. If you have a very homogeneous group, this could be brought up for learners to help them develop empathy, to help them see the world from the eyes of the other. So this is something that's really interesting to develop, especially thinking of teenagers. And mostly that's what I had to share with you. Here I have some reference materials for you in terms of project work, and this explains a little better how in different ways we can deal with projects, and talking about the flexibility of projects and how they can fit different teaching contexts as well. And I'd like to thank you very much for joining me. I'm so sorry I couldn't see your questions to answer. I was dying for the questions. It makes it much more interesting, I'd say, but it's okay. And if you want to talk to me, you can drop me a line at leticia@troikabr.com. You can follow us in the social media as well. And please drop me a line if you want to share your views and your ideas on the matter. Thank you very much.